I wish to make a complaint.
Sorry, we're closing for lunch.
Never mind that, my lad. I wish to complain about this parrot what I purchased not half an hour ago from this very boutique.
Oh, yes, the Norwegian blue. What's wrong with it?
I'll tell you what's wrong with it. It's dead. That's what's wrong with it.
All right, so Chris, you gave me two essays that we were going to discuss this week, and the first one was all about how much you love Trump. The second one was all about how much you love Milton Friedman. You seem to give people the impression that you're a crypto
right,
something or other. Yeah,
not crypto, right?
No, just right out.
Just straight up. So so we're all Friedmanites now.
Yes, right. That's how you started your essay, I think, or just pretty close to the beginning.
That's the title. That's the so it's in the Platypus Review, in the April issue. So out now. Why not Trump again? I'm gonna give a version of it at a panel discussion for Platypus at our international convention this weekend. The opening plenary panel on the crisis of liberal democracy. So, but we're all Friedmanites now. Originally written for Compact magazine, but the editorial process became too protracted, and so I withdrew it, and now published it in Platypus. And it's also going to be in the book, the forthcoming book. So Marxism and Politics will have both of these articles. We'll have, as a postscript, Why Not Trump again? And as one of the final articles in the book, We're All Friedmanites Now. It comes at the end of a section called Socialism and Capitalism. So I originally, was solicited to write it for Compact. It's a review essay of Jennifer Burns's recent biography of Milton Friedman, published last fall. And I had long been someone who would argue against the kind of caricature of Friedman that the left has. And so I had written about this already in an article on Hayek and Friedman that was really pitched against Naomi Klein and her shock doctrine and disaster capitalism thesis. Where I basically said, look, there's this other history to neoliberalism and ordoliberalism, the Austrian school of economics, that really we did not get that in the neoliberal era of capitalism. We didn't get their program. We got something very different. And I hadn't really had the opportunity to elaborate this very much, and I don't fully elaborate it in this article either, but there are some things that I'd point out. And a basic point would be that the Friedmanite vision was based on the post-World War II prosperity, but was taken up and implemented in a partial way in a period of downturn and austerity. So it was based on the boom and the prosperity, but then it was implemented under these other conditions of downturn and austerity after the 1973 crisis, but already after a crisis that was manifesting in the late 60s with automation. So basically, Milton Friedman is this kind of vexed figure. And you might appreciate this, Doug. I start with really what was interesting to me about Jennifer Burns's biography is that it confirmed my view of Friedman. So I had read some things by Friedman. I had read Hayek and Friedman. I had read, Capitalism and Freedom by Friedman, which is perhaps better than Free to Choose. So that's in the context of the 2008 crisis. I had read those things, and Hayek, of course, The Road to Serfdom. And I feel like the left has this kind of caricature, and again, it comes from Stalinism, and it comes from a kind of third world nationalism. It comes out of defense of what was undone in the neoliberal era, as if those things were undone by policies, rather than having undermined themselves and there being a crisis that then neoliberal policies spoke to. My old mentor Adolf Fried, put it in a way that I don't quote him, but that's where I get the idea from, which is that there are two aspects to neoliberalism: upward redistribution of income, concentration of wealth, upwards, and free market reform. And really, we didn't get free market reform, but we did get upward redistribution of income. So it was called free market reform, but it was actually redistribution of income upwards. And then the question is, well, why was that done? And it wasn't done because of the greed of the capitalists, I would say. It was done out of an actual need of capitalism, which is different. In other words, there was a value crisis of capital that necessitated greater concentration, greater accumulation of capital.
Let me ask you something about the redistribution of income upwards.
Mm-hmm.
When you say that, are you talking about wages as opposed to profits or capital?
No,
So
profit as opposed to wages.
Right. Okay. So, right. Okay. So
why did we need higher profits and lower wages in the last 50 years than was the case in the post-war boom era? That's the question. That was
right.
a necessity.
Because there's another way to conceive of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of the distribution of income upwards would be the creation of more monopolies and more concentration of capital, so that rather than having a lot of middle class capitalists or petit bourgeois companies, you had a few big corporations, and that would also distribute money upwards into fewer and fewer hands.
Mm-hmm.
This is just coming to me now.
That would be a way of thinking about it, but that would be the old progressive way of thinking about it from the turn of the 20th century.
Right. But it is what happened to a degree in that period of time under neoliberalism, I think. One of the, when I got started reading,
here's confession of your petty bourgeois perspective, Doug. You're like, monopoly, destroy the smaller capitalists.
I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that happened.
Right.
But when I got involved with, trying to understand Marx, I got involved for the MHI and Andrew Kleinman. And one of the big points that Andrew Kleinman made, and he wrote for Truth Dig about this a couple of times, was that in fact wages haven't declined. Not when you include the benefits that have accrued.
Right.
And that what's happened instead is that there's been a stratification of within the working class, so that you have to think about the distribution of wages throughout the working class rather than strictly between profits.
Right.
And then you throw in the fact that profits have declined. So there's been a decline of profitability, there's been a decline in productive investment and financialization. And so that creates more monopoly power, the financialization, I believe. And so that was his explanation, not even a critique of what was going on around the economic crisis.
Right.
But yeah. So I just bring all that, but I bring that all that up actually as a prelude to asking, because one of the things about your essay is that you said that neither Keynes nor Friedman really had their ideas implemented.
That's right.
And they're both kind of monetarist approaches to correcting the problems within capitalism.
Yes.
Do you think they weren't implemented because the policymakers, for political reasons, or do you think that that there was something about the underlying conditions that made it impossible to implement those things, or were they the kinds? What wasn't implemented in the case of Keynes? What wasn't implemented in the case of Friedman, and then why? I guess is what I'm asking.
Okay, so with Keynes, it's complicated because Keynes is a product of the pre-World War I era and Pax Britannica, right? So we were talking about Pax Americana, but there was before that Pax Britannica, and it was a very internationalized form of capitalism. And Keynes was very anti-nationalist. right? He was he thought that nationalism was destructive, counterproductive, economically, but also, politically, socially, culturally, so he saw a danger in the settlement of World War One and, the Treaty of Versailles, but also into the post-World War One period, the danger being a kind of economic nationalism. So the clearest way of describing this is that Keynes was turned into an economics of nationalism, nationalist capitalism, right? So it's like I said, these are complex issues that have a number of different layers and dimensions to them, right? So again, Keynes is trying to navigate the crisis of the war, World War One, and come out on the other end with a reformed version of what the global economy was before World War One, so as to prevent future wars, of course, but also in order to realize the possibilities of what we might call, imperial monopoly capitalism. Right? So he's a progressive in that sense. So Friedman, he's a neoliberal or an ordo-liberal. And, I point out in the essay that he was condemned by Ludwig von Mises at the Mont Pelerin Society for being a socialist. All right, so basically, the left has this kind of like myth that Friedman is an anti-New Deal guy. He's not. He's not. Right?
He is and he isn't, right? I mean, on the one hand,
not economically.
Right, but he was. I remember watching him give a lecture where he said, "Listen, if you want open borders, if you want people to be able to travel freely, you can't have the state be responsible for the general welfare of the nation on this level. You have to have the market work out so that people can work to survive rather than rely on welfare payments. And if you don't do that, then you're going to have to close the border because the nation state can't withstand an unproductive influx of people who aren't going to be contributing to and taking more from the welfare state than they give in. Something along those lines is what I recall him saying. So that the welfare state itself set up nationalist terms for the world economy.
Sure.
So in a sense, he was against the New Deal, if we think of the New Deal as
nationalistic,
nationalistic, and a matter of creating both maybe minimum wages and making sure people were employed even if the market wouldn't bear it, but also more importantly, if we think of it in terms of Social Security and welfare payments and
okay,
welfare.
So this is where again. Jennifer Burns, the biography, is helpful in shifting the focus away from like market to automation.
Yeah.
Meaning, what is Milton Friedman? What's the problem that Milton Friedman is actually facing? And he faced the problem of automation. And again, the part of Milton Friedman that we didn't get is the UBI,
right,
which he advocated. And he advocated it because of the problem of automation. Right, so that's one thing to keep the focus on, right? Because he saw that as the essential problem. And then there are other things that flow and that are associated with that. But if we turn him into just this like free marketeer, then we're going to sort of actually shift the emphasis in a way that's not true to where Friedman was coming from. Meaning, again, von Mises, thought he's a socialist, Milton Friedman and Hayek, that they're socialists, because they accepted a certain amount of state management of the economy as inevitable, right? As an irreversible historical necessity. So then the question is, how do we best realize that?
Right.
And what is the essential problem that the state is going to have to manage? Automation.
Right. Right. You know, have you ever read Kurt Vonnegut's first novel, Player Piano? Have you ever read Kurt Vonnegut's first novel, Player Piano?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, that came out in 1952.
Yes.
And it was all about automation
Yes.
and stratification between the managers and the engineers and the working people who no longer had much of a role in society. But the way that was conceived of was not about as a world of poverty.
Right.
It was conceived of as a world where there was primarily social class divisions between the managers and
not economic.
Right.
Right. So there's a hierarchy, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a rich-poor hierarchy.
Right. Yeah, and it wasn't conceived of as in that way in 1952. The problem of automation wasn't conceived of as a problem of unemployment. It was.
Right.
It was a problem of unemployment, but it was a problem of unemployment that in the context of a fully functioning welfare state, like where.
Right. So disempowerment of people, not just their abject poverty.
Right.
Right.
And that's what Friedman was trying to address.
He is trying to address that. Absolutely. So he is dealing with freedom at that level. But again, another assumption that we might have that would also be, to my mind, unwarranted is that he's only concerned with the freedom of the individual. No, he is concerned with the freedom of society itself. And that's why Burns, in our biography, says, look, he's not an economist. He works in political economy.
Right.
And he understands that the issue of political economy is freedom. And freedom is not just individual, but social, collective. In other words, free to choose is not just about individual choice. It's about, as a society, are we able to choose? Or are we locking ourselves into things in a way that, we might not even be aware of how we're limiting our choices as a society?
Can you give me a couple of examples of the ways in which Friedman saw, in the time of relative security and economic boom, that we were locking ourselves into a kind of social system that we didn't want to?
Well, I point out the role of labor unions. So, he was, first and foremost, Friedman was against crony capitalism. In other words, capitalism that depended on the favoritism of the state, or as Republicans like to say, the state shouldn't be in the business of choosing winners and losers. So labor unions, which started out as collective bargaining units for the working class against the capitalist class, became collusive through the state. In other words, they became part of the crony capitalist system. Right. So he wasn't against labor unions. He wasn't against workers' rights or collective bargaining. He again thought that ship had sailed, that was just a reality. What he was against was the role the labor unions played in propping up crony capitalism. Political favoritism.
Right.
Right. And so now what's interesting, I always like to point this out. So we think of the New Deal era as, and certainly the New Left responded to this, the compromise of the labor unions, that the labor unions had become basically extensions of management. And, that basically there were these three, there's the capitalists, there's the state, and there are the workers. And basically there was this managerial layer that cemented the three together. So there's a kind of state bureaucracy, there's a monopoly corporate bureaucracy, and then there's a labor bureaucracy, and they're all colluding. And so, why is that a problem? Right? It's only a problem insofar as it actually binds us to things. In other words, it creates a kind of an inertia where it's hard to change track. So what we were talking about in the first half about, like, I don't know, the Vietnam War or the forever wars and the war on terror, that once they start, you can never stop them. Right? And why is that? Well, because of this nexus.
Right.
Of the state and capitalism. Right? And then we wonder, it's like, oh, the military-industrial complex is keeping it going. Okay, yeah. Why does the state need a military-industrial complex? Right? That's the question, right? Because obviously the military-industrial complex couldn't come into existence without the state.
Right.
So, why did the state create this beast, as Nixon put it? There's this beast, and, you can't stop it.
Right.
You can try to fight it, but you really can't, right? So, again, looked at the level of political economy, and this is why I brought in Danielle Bell as a contemporary of Friedman. Danielle Bell, who was a research assistant of the Frankfurt School when they were at Columbia University. And so he's around the Shachtmanites, he's around the Trotskyists, he's a Marxist, he is. And
he also wrote something about the death of ideology, or the
end of ideology in the 1950s. Yeah. That's right, because he basically saw what was, he's one of the theorists of the convergence thesis, which is that the United States and the Soviet Union are more similar than they are different.
Right.
Right. And again, it has to do with this kind of bureaucratized, statified society, and that has submitted itself to economic efficiency. So the means has become an end in itself. Right. So society is becoming more socialized. Like, he basically took the old Marxist idea of the socialization of the means of production versus the privatization of profit. Right. And he turned that into a means ends rationality problem, which you see in, like, Lukács, and Lukács gets it from Marx, the idea that the means is irrational, but the end is irrational, right? The means becomes an end in itself, and therefore eludes any kind of social decision making, and really it eludes freedom. We lose our freedom as a society, because we just have to keep these things going, whether they're actually serving us or not. We serve them, these processes. We serve this mechanism. Right. And so the question is, well, how do we escape from that? Or at least, how do we manage it better if we so I'm not going to say that, like, Friedman, for example, he's not a thinker of the left. He's not. But if he's a thinker of the right, he's a thinker of the right in the way that all capitalist politics is right-wing. Meaning it's opportunist. It accepts certain things about capitalism as unchangeable. Right. As fundamentally unchangeable. So he certainly is not like a socialist or anything like that, by any means. He doesn't believe that that's possible. But he's also not simply a worshiper of capitalism. Right. So he basically thinks, okay, we have capitalism. We're stuck with it. What can we do?
It's a miracle, too. Capitalism is a great wonder, I think Friedman would say. And so would Marx.
Sure.
Right?
Sure. Well, bourgeois society is a wonder and a miracle. That's freedom. Freedom is a miracle, right? Freedom is a
right. But I mean, I just remember how he would talk about all the different workers and all the different parts that went into making a pencil. And organizing, and that's capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, he does what everybody does. A left, right, everybody does this. They conflate capitalism and bourgeois society. They conflate cooperation and capitalism. Meaning, again, the Marxist humanist perspective on this, for example, would highlight this aspect, which I agree with, which is capitalism is cooperation. It is socialized production, but in alienated form.
Right.
It's alienated social production. It's alienated cooperation.
Right.
And of course,
the capitalists, the people like Friedman would say, yes, and we just have to live with that level of alienation. That basically was what they.
And they would say that all societies are alienated in that way. That's just a function of living in a society.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So Rousseauian, it is a kind of classical liberal idea. Now, again, I'm not going to say that there isn't a certain kind of individualism to Friedman. In other words, he's concerned with the unfreedom of the collective. And there is reason for us to be concerned about that, for sure. Mm-hmm. And so that might tend him in an individualistic direction. But again, what is he accepting about that as just a basic fact of society? That's where it comes out of ordo-liberalism. Mm-hmm. Right? And I would just say that, again, his concerns are collective. Right? He's not Ayn Rand or something, which, by the way, Jennifer Burns, the biographer, her previous book was on Ayn Rand. Mm. Right? And so when the Compact editors asked me to review her biography, and I looked her up, and I was like, oh, she wrote a biography of Ayn Rand. Mm-hmm. And I could tell, I didn't read that book, but I could tell it was hostile to Rand. Mm-hmm. So I thought, okay, is this going to be some hack job on Friedman, where it's a kind of a caricature? It's the usual caricature. Well, no, it wasn't. And I was pleasantly surprised, because basically what I intuited a lot about Friedman, knowing his background and reading him semi-superficially, but I got enough to know that the left was lying about Friedman, but I intuited some things about him. And it was nice to read this 600-something page biography by Burns and realize I was right. And even to the point where I pinched myself, I was like, oh, am I just seeing this here? So I shared the book with Spencer Leonard, and I was like, Spencer, just check this for me. Is she actually saying what I think she's saying? Mm-hmm. And she is. So she's like a progressive liberal, historian, biographer. And, and she was sort of, surprised to discover that Friedman was a progressive. Mm-hmm. Right?
Well, let me ask you something. This is maybe maybe this won't work, but what do you think Milton Friedman would think of Mario Savio, in particular, when he was complaining on the steps of Sproul Hall and saying about President Kerr? He says, if President Kerr actually tried to get something more liberal out of the regents in the telephone conversation, why didn't he make some public statement to that effect? And the answer we received from a well-meaning liberal was the following. He said, would you ever imagine the manager of a firm making a statement publicly in opposition to his board of directors? That's the answer. Well, I'll ask you to consider, if this is a firm, and if the board of regents are the board of directors, and if the President Kerr is in fact the manager, then I tell you something. The faculty are a bunch of employees, and we're the raw materials. And then he goes on, but we are a bunch of raw materials that don't mean to have any process upon us, don't mean to be made into any product, don't mean to end up being bought by some clients of the university, be they government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone. We're human beings. So what do you think Milton Friedman would make of what Mario Savio is saying there?
I think that he would sympathize, first of all. Second of all, he might think it's a little naive. He might think, well, but that's all can be the case. But third of all, I think it would depend then on what the demands were. In other words, okay, that's all well and good. However, what do you think flows from that? What are the policies that you're proposing? And then Friedman would say, okay, maybe the things you're proposing aren't going to work out the way you think. Right? So that would be his general attitude towards it. Right? He would say, yes, this is a concern, but to a certain extent, this is inevitable. And so it all hinges on what you propose to do about it.
Well, here's what Mario Savio proposed to do. He said, we'll do something which hasn't occurred at this university in a good long time. We're going to have real classes up there. They're going to be freedom schools conducted up there. We're going to have classes on the First and 14th Amendments. We're going to spend our time learning about the things that this university is afraid that we know. We're going to learn about freedom up there. We're going to learn by doing. What do you make of that?
So what were the issues? In other words, why...
That was a free speech movement, right? That was that.
What kind of speech was being curtailed?
Political speech. Just like if you were opposed to the war in Vietnam, which wasn't fully underway, a lot of these people came out of the civil rights movement.
Right.
So
right.
Talking about the civil rights movement.
Right.
Those are the two main things that I remember. But the point was there was actually in the free speech movement a coalition that included conservatives on the campus because they had been blocked from doing any political tabling or displaying any political speech at all at the University of Berkeley. And so they were just demanding their free speech rights as students.
So why the 14th Amendment, do you think?
I don't remember. Yeah, which one is that again? That's terrible.
It's one of the Reconstruction Amendments.
Which one?
It's one of the Reconstruction Amendments. Right?
Oh.
So I think that, believe it or not, Roe versus Wade was decided on the basis of the 14th Amendment.
It might have been, well, I mean, I don't know why he said the 14th Amendment. Let's see.
I'm just wondering whether it's because these kids wanted to be able to have sex and not.
Well, probably.
Right? Like,
I know that by 68.
right?
No, I mean, they were trying to get rid of the locus parentis or whatever. You know, they were definitely. And by 68 in Paris, that was a big part of what started the student movement there.
So the right to privacy is something that's imputed to the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
And so a lot of, Roe versus Wade, contraception, loving decision might have been 14th Amendment as well. Eventually, striking down the sodomy laws, gay marriage, a lot is hinged on the 14th Amendment. A lot.
Right.
And so that's the more interesting one than the First Amendment, because the 14th Amendment is really about the rights to our person.
Right.
Our personhood, right? Privacy rights. I think that's probably the more interesting case, meaning that it's not just like the free speech movement was probably about the freedoms, the civil liberties of students per se. Right. On campus. Right. More broadly than just, can I say something or can I start a club on campus freely? Freedom of association, freedom of speech.
Right. But that's what they named themselves after. That.
Well, that's pithy and it's fine. But again, what extends from that? Right. And we know that the sexual revolution is in the making. Feminism is in the making. Right. We know that these are all of the same moment. And the way they're perceived is they're perceived as state restrictions on private life.
But not just state restrictions. That's the thing. It was a university.
Quasi-state. Quasi-state. Right. Because it's a public school system.
That's true. But also the labor unions were thrown in there. That's what brought it to mind was that they were no more enamored with labor.
Right.
Than they were with anything else, really. And
sure, absolutely. I mean, again, we would be tempted to yearn for the days where labor unions hired workers directly on behalf of corporations, and therefore were plugged in with things like school systems.
Right.
Vocational training in the public school system as a path directly into employment.
Right. And out of that school into middle management of some kind or pretty.
Yeah. So you would go from high school to like skilled working class. You'd go from college to management.
Right.
right? That would have been the essential difference in the discrimination of the job market according to education. It would have been very direct. I mean, it still is pretty much direct, right? Although now you need for a lot of working class jobs, you need a college degree,
Right.
Even if it's only a community college, 2-year, but still, right?
Right.
It used to be straight out of high school, and so and we do know also that the relationship between high school and college was also much tighter back then.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's what I imagine, again, that is socialized production.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That is socialized production. Where Friedman would be probably more of a conservative in the face of this. Like Danielle Bell. Like Danielle Bell was sympathetic to the students in the Columbia University 1968 takeover, but he was also critical of the students' demands because he thought that they were kind of hopeless. Of basic reality. And insofar as that more organized, apparently more organized capitalism, because capitalism is still quite organized, was broken up. It was broken up by the 60s social movements and by these kinds of protests. But as Adorno recognized, he said this can only lead to the further bureaucratization of higher education.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. So, I mean, interestingly enough, so there are all sorts of assumptions built into these judgments by like a Danielle Bell or an Adorno or a Friedman that are quite strange to us now because we're not living in that era.
Right.
Right.
Well, I wanted to bring up the Mario Savio quote because you were talking about how Friedman wanted to create conditions of freedom for society and for individuals. And the free speech movement and the New Left in general seems to me to have presaged and maybe sped up the process of neoliberalization as well, that their demands were turned into exactly what you mentioned, a reason to both commodify more of the world to focus on individuality much more than had been the case before, but also to empower the state in new ways and to.
So let me say something about my perspective on these things. So, I kind of had a breakthrough moment like quite a while ago. So before Platypus, before the millennial left, I had this sort of breakthrough moment teaching classical sociology at the University of Chicago, Durkheim, Weber, but also teaching Adam Smith and teaching Marx, because I didn't teach Marx before I taught him at the University of Chicago. I didn't really have that opportunity because I was even before I was teaching at the School of the Art Institute, where my ability to teach Marx is pretty limited in comparison to the College Core. And that was, like we've talked about before, the commodity form, right? Why I insist that the commodity form is not the problem, because that is the socialization of production. That's not the destruction of the socialization of production. That is the socialization of production. So the distinction between commodity and capital is important, meaning the commodity form does not entail, actually, the accumulation of capital. It does not. So whereas now capitalism, this isn't really a commodity economy. It's a capitalist economy. That's the point. And meaning that it's not about preserving the commodity form anymore. It's about preserving capital. That's where, again, like, there are certain things that would just be assumed, right? So someone like Milton Friedman would assume, well, okay, we've transcended commodity production. It's now inevitable. And the way that that's usually understood is technology. In other words, what are the actual needs of capital accumulation? It's technology, right? There is a kind of fetish of technology, or as the Frankfurt School called it, a veil of technology, where we think that the necessities of capital are due to technology, that they're really the necessities of technology. And no, they're different. And again, that would be a basic Marx point, which is that actually capitalism can't be understood as just a technological revolution, but as a social crisis. Meaning it's a technological revolution that exists within bourgeois social relations, contradicts those bourgeois social relations, and is a hindrance on technology itself. Because we don't have just technology, we have technology as it serves the needs of capital accumulation. That's the technology that we have. We don't have technology that isn't serving capital accumulation.
I feel like you must have a different definition of commodity than I do, or I have a different definition of capital than you do, or something, because it seems to me that, okay, the commodity form, as I understand it, is not simply something useful that people make together, right? It's
no.
Right. The commodity form is when the labor time, it's when the labor time that's spent in production is set up as a value that mediates distribution through exchange, right?
But also production, like first and foremost.
Well, right, but it does that, but it does that as through exchange of commodities.
We produce for others. So now you could say we've always produced for others. In other words, like you could say modes of production, it's always been socialized production. So the question is, what's the basis of socialized production? I mean, basically, Adam Smith thinks that there was always commodity production.
Right.
Because he understands cooperation at the level of the peasant village to be exchange.
Yeah, but the point is that the labor time it's spent in production is what mediates the relationship between commodities.
All right, I'll remind us of Hegel. What mediates is what embodies contradiction.
Okay.
Right? So in other words, what we could say is that we wouldn't see commodity production the way we do now without the contradiction of the Industrial Revolution. Meaning,
I think that's true, but the point is that it mediates exchange as equivalence because of the average labor time it takes to produce commodities, working themselves out as quantities in exchange. That's what.
Right, labor time as the basis of commensurability. Right. Again, you could say that goes all the way back, because you could say social cooperation is about means of subsistence. It's about survival. And so basically, the basis of exchange at the level of, like, I don't know, peasant village. So sticking with Adam Smith, thinking that truck barter exchange is essential to human nature. It's what hunters and gatherers do. The men exchange the meat for the berries. Right? No, but seriously. So how many berries have to be?
But not as equivalents.
Check it out.
Not as equivalents.
Check it out. The equivalence is life itself. Meaning, how much meat do women need to live that they can't go out and hunt for themselves? How many berries and nuts do the women have to gather to keep the men alive? In other words, the rhythm of life is the rhythm of life. Like, production is in the service of life. It is.
Right.
So the time is the time of living, meaning you need a certain amount of subsistence in a certain amount of time.
Sure, but that's not an equivalence of labor time. It just isn't.
No, it isn't. Not in Marxist terms. But again, the equivalence of labor time or labor time mediating means that labor time has actually become contradictory for industrial producers in a way that's not the case when it's berries and meat.
In a tribe, like you're describing, the people who are exchanging berries and meat are bound together socially by something other than that exchange. They have a way of identifying themselves as having a shared life, and they don't think of the people down the road or across the river as needing to participate in their life together. And that exchange that's taking place is not taking place on the level of labor time.
They're not counting calories. They're definitely not counting calories.
No, not counting calories, and they're not counting labor hours, and they're probably not even counting berries. Like the
they're counting berries and they're counting meat. They are.
they're probably keeping track of it, but
yeah,
there's
you
nobody.
have to harvest a certain amount and you have to hunt a certain amount in order for there to be a just exchange.
Yeah, I just don't think they're thinking of things in terms of exchange, but rather in terms of their duty to the tribe or to the group and their social roles in a more kind of a religious context.
Yes, I certainly agree with that. Right. In other words, they're not economizing, to use the Daniel Bell expression, in the same way, but they're inheriting a way of life that has built into it what we might say an economic relation. I'm just sticking with Marx and Engels.
Sure, yeah. I mean, no, there's always an economic component. We can see it, impose it backwards, but the difference is that now that because of the freedom of labor and that socially necessary labor time is what sets up our relations rather than
we're revolutionizing production.
Yeah.
And how are we constrained in our revolutionizing of production? We're constrained in our revolutionizing of production in that we have to preserve the value of production in a particular way.
Right.
And not because anyone makes a choice about it, but objectively. In the same way that objectively the tribe had to hunt a certain amount of animals and gather a certain amount of produce, we are objectively compelled to preserve the value of production in a way that actually limits our ability to change our production.
Right. And also it even will limit our ability to sustain life.
Oh, well, sure. But that's all secondary anyway. In other words, that's where the religious metaphor comes in, because after all, the tribe was more interested in preserving their cultural values than they were interested in preserving human beings. But of course, those cultural values can only be preserved if the human beings were preserved, at least to a certain extent.
Enough of them. Yeah. And right. So, okay. Right. But my point is that commodity form, which comes from the freedom of labor to do any kind of work at all, and that for the value in the commodities to be measured to be measured in the time spent in production, that is what defines a commodity to me.
As an objective thing, though, it's a curious phenomenon, because Adam Smith didn't say that labor time was the basis of exchange. He said it should be the basis of exchange. And he said it should be the basis of exchange in order to maximize productivity. In other words, he didn't think that that actually was the basis of exchange, but he advocated it because he thought that that would actually increase productivity, and that also people would do that out of a desire for freedom.
Did he think the average socially necessary labor time should be what sets up exchange, or did he think the individual amount of time?
Individual amount of time, right? Socially necessary labor time is a Marxist idea, and the reason that it's a Marxist idea is that Marx is highlighting the crisis of socially necessary labor time in capitalism.
Right.
Meaning we're objectively compelled by socially necessary labor time. However, in our action that is so compelled, we actually undermine the value of socially necessary labor time.
Right.
This is why it's hyper dialectical. It's like super dialectical,
Right. No, I know. Because I know all. I mean, nothing you said so far is not something I already know.
Right.
But what I'm trying to get at is
just tracing it through. Right.
Yeah. Why is it when you say the commodity form isn't what's at issue? But rather capital is what's at issue. Though I balk at that, and I'm wondering, what is it that we're conceiving differently?
Well, because I think that there's a lot of anti-capitalism that is actually anti-bourgeois, and that should not be the case. Meaning, the Marxist view of socialism and of the problem of capitalism being imminent to socialism is actually not anti-bourgeois. It's not this romantic, we should go back to the customs of a cultural community and moral values as opposed to economic values.
Right.
That ship has sailed. In other words, we might desire that, but that's not going to happen. And for objective reasons, meaning it's a global society in which the actual labor process, the technology we use, the way we use it, this compulsion is built in, right? So we can try to, I don't know, have religious fundamentalism and have some other value system, but objectively, no, we're in this now.
Right. I know.
Right.
And that makes it very difficult to try to subjectively even imagine getting beyond it. We
don't need to. We don't need to. This is my big thing, not prefigurative. I'm not anti-prefigurative, not anti-utopian in that sense. We only need to follow the logic of bourgeois social relations. In other words, workers are going to try to maximize the value of their commodity. And in so doing, yes, and in so doing, they're going to be compelled to struggle for socialism. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, otherwise it's just the technician saying, couldn't we use technology differently? And then it's not the activity of the working class anymore. Then it's not Marxism or socialism anymore. It's just technocracy. And then you're in the player piano world.
Right. Oh, or in the novel Bash Bash Revolution. Which I read. Because that was the one where...
In other words, why did Marxism insist on the working class? Not out of sentimentality. Not out of sentimentality.
No, I know that. Yeah.
Right?
I just feel like one of the steps that will have to be... We're going to have to break from labor time, socially necessary labor time, mediating our exchanges and our social relations. And that's
true. But we're going to address it stepwise. Meaning, first it has to fully come into view. Right? In other words, it can't just be, oh, it really sucks that we work so hard and get so little.
But that's where it's going to start.
That's where it can start. But again, we also want to deal with the working class as political actors, not just as economic actors. So Danielle Bell, hedonism, right? In other words, is it materialism in that sense, in the sense that we're for the hedonism of the working class? Well, no, because we know that human societies, including our society now, has been motivated by more than just hedonism. Like, there is social solidarity. In other words, people are willing to sacrifice their personal pleasure for a higher purpose.
Right.
And how is that abused in capitalism? Because it is abused.
When some people who will frequently watch videos we produce and that I produce, and they'll say to me, how does this help the working class? If it doesn't help the working class, I don't see the point of it. And I've written, I've created a little critical cuts or done an interview about the loss of our political rights in the First Amendment, right? And then it's like, what do you mean? So, like, what are you saying? I'm not getting you a raise at the end of this video? What are you talking about that it doesn't help the working class? But I think people do have a very limited view. When they talk about materialism, they mean something similar to that. Like,
they do.
Getting more cash, getting better conditions, getting more UBI, something like that.
Yep. I mean, did I tell you the story? One of my fellow PhD students at the University of Chicago did a study of the People's Park.
Yeah, which came out of the free speech movement.
That's right. So at the People's Park, there were the squares, the leftists, who were very cleanly dressed, and then there were the hippies.
Yeah.
And the hippies accused the leftists of being on a power trip.
Yeah.
Which, of course, they were. Now, the question is, what kind of power trip and whose power trip? So, of course, it was a PMC power trip.
Right.
What about the working class? In other words, the working class is going to have to desire power, political power, social power. Right? We're dealing with the working class as political actors, as social actors. Now, nowadays, I mean, look, I'm from a working class background. They just want to survive pleasantly as possible, right? They want to maximize pleasure, avoid pain. That's what they want to do. Okay, But sometimes they want more than that. Sometimes they do want to participate in the direction of society and politics.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And not only to serve a pleasure principle,
Mm-hmm.
right? But also their willingness to sacrifice that in the name of a higher ideal. And that's what we have to pay attention to at the level of political ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the realm of higher ideals. And again, social solidarity and the perversions of social solidarity into things like nationalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Including like racialized nationalism or culturalized nationalism or religious nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
right? And again, socialism is going to be about that. And at another level, and this is again what the left can't see, that is bourgeois.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Bourgeois is not just hedonistic.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Bourgeois is not just about buying cheap and selling dear.
Why can't people remember that? That's so. If in the 60s, you would call people bourgeois for being uptight, and square,
right,
and wearing beige.
Right. But I'm just thinking of the bourgeois revolutionaries, why I defend the founding fathers, because some of them were rich people, but guess what? They were willing to die.
Yeah. But you shocked the bourgeoisie by going to a party and doing a bunch of drugs and wearing psychedelic colors, remember?
Until that becomes the bourgeoisie's own.
Right. I guess
time.
I'm old. I forget that's already been overcome. But that.
So it's just it's one of these things where again freedom, and Burns in her biography of Friedman, she sees that the freedom that he's concerned with is the freedom of the working class.
Right.
And think about the market. We think of a market in goods.
Mm-hmm.
We might think of a market in capital, but we seldom think about the market of labor. And the freedom of bourgeois society for the working class is the freedom of the labor market. You can quit your job.
Right.
That's huge.
Yeah, no, it becomes a seller's market.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the labor working class wants, is a seller's market.
Yeah, not a buyer's market. And, so Friedman, and I'm not saying that he's fully self-conscious about this, but he is cognizant of it to some extent, to some appreciable extent, which is to say crony capitalism is unfreedom for the working class.
Right.
How much more Marxist do we have to get than that?
A bit, but not that much.
But not that much, right? And so, in other words, the question is, what's the real reason for that? In other words, is it bureaucratization, statism? Is it wrong choices, policy-wise? No, Marxism would insist that there's a deeper issue.
Right.
That's going to go beyond any reforms that Friedman might have advocated or formulated.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I liked most about your essay and about how you've talked about Friedman in the past was how you pointed out how this is not what you've been talking about today, but you point out there's some commonalities between, well, basically you point out that he was a progressive. I mean, that there's a commonality in viewpoints between Keynes and Friedman, that in fact, those people who would be most staunchly against Milton Friedman today share a lot of his core assumptions. And you can see that in the way that progressives and even leftists are taking up UBI as some sort of great project of emancipation, and that to vilify Friedman,
that's the problem,
does stop us from being able to critique him and ourselves in the same go. So.
And it sort of really occludes the basic issues of capitalism. In other words, anti-neoliberalism is a poor form of critique of capitalism.
Yeah.
Right, because you're going to mistake capitalism for some policies.
Do you remember before Trump when everybody was railing against capitalism, but they were railing against it and then using the word neoliberalism interchangeably with it?
Yes, absolutely. Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's where the millennial left kind of started out and has kind of remained, unfortunately. Meaning that can they really disaggregate? And I feel like, you know, again, the advantage of our generation, we're older, because we saw neoliberalism coming into existence, and because there still was a memory of what had come before. I mean, another way of thinking about it is the discontents of the Keynesian Fordist form of capitalism led to neoliberalism, meaning popular discontents. Like, why did the working class turn against labor unions? Because they did. You know?
Yeah.
And because they saw them as constraining.
Right.
You know, they saw them as a labor racket, which they are. You know? And the new social movements definitely criticized labor unions for their racketeering. You know, I wrote about this in The Death of the Millennial Left. You know, an uncomfortable fact of history is that the height of de jure segregation, racial segregation, and racial stratification in the workforce coincides with the height of union power.
Right.
Right. And so there was a black nationalist critique and a third worldist critique and a kind of neo-Marxist or neo-Leninist or like Maoist critique that this was like the labor aristocracy. And, you know, we get it all the way down to BLM, racial capitalism, right? White privilege, right? White skin privilege, the myth of the white proletariat, settlers, all this kind of stuff comes from that reality that they faced. And we can't deny it. Right? We can't say, oh, no, it wasn't really like that. No, there were many reasons to object to labor unions, but again, not because they represented the collective bargaining rights of the working class. Or
even white workers, particularly.
Absolutely. Right? That's right. But that there were rackets. And they are rackets. They still are rackets, right? So this is where, you know, the neoliberal critique of labor unions has a kernel of truth.
Right.
You know, and that's the thing. So it's kind of like, you know, if you think that, oh, the working class is like bamboozled through like individualism or something. No, it was more than just individuals. It was communities. They recognized the limitations and the constraint of the older form of capitalism. And so they were only too happy to see it go, but also to participate in overthrowing it, right? Including voting with your feet. Voting with your feet. Meaning, I'm going to get a non-union job and not a union job. You know, I'm going to move to a less unionized state. From a heavily unionized state, you know, for a variety of reasons. Now, again, that's society. That's the spontaneous, organic transformations of capitalism that the capitalists themselves, as well as the politicians, have to deal with. Right? So again, the technocratic view is, oh, these policies were corrupt because they were demanded by interested parties. And then, you know, they did these bad things, and maybe they were intentionally bad, but then they failed. And so now we're going to come in and change the policies. Like, well, that's not really how we're going to overcome capitalism.
No.
Right? So we have to pay attention to the different levels at which these things operate. Yeah, yes, it is top down. There are state policies. There are actions taken by corporations and by rich capitalists, but it's also bottom up. It's also, capitalism is a grassroots phenomenon. and capitalism is regenerated from below, not just from above. It's not just maintained and managed from above, because we know that that maintenance and management doesn't really work. It's spontaneously regenerated from below in a much more powerful way than it's maintained from the top, because the way it's maintained from the top is always iffy and doesn't really work out. So that's, again, why I insist on, otherwise we're going to end up in a place where quickly, as leftists, we're going to discover that the workers are compromised by capitalism, that they're very bourgeois, right? And, we're going to become disenchanted, and we're going to be like, oh, fuck, the working class is so bourgeois. And it's like, yeah, and that's our only hope.
Right. I mean, right. Often enough lately, I think that, certainly in the last year, I think of those people who are bourgeois. The problem with the people who call themselves bourgeois, or they call themselves classical liberals,
right.
They're not.
They're not.
Right.
No, I'm interested in the bourgeois values of the working class.
Right.
Not like what people screw themselves intellectually into.
Right. But I noticed lately, and I'm going to try to see if I can segue into something about Hamas and Israel and all of that, because before we leave, because there's a remnants left from our last conversation that maybe we should talk about.
Okay.
But I've just noticed, and I kind of get worn down a little bit by this, that it seems to me that the left and now really, because I'm on Twitter, I can see this is happening on the right as well. It's really happening overall. Is just keeps getting set back into old debates that it's not even like we keep making the same mistakes exactly. We do that, but it's also that we, like, all of a sudden we're replaying arguments about video games that we already had on the platform in 2014, like 10 years ago, in exactly the same terms. And sometimes people will bring up, I remember this when this happened 10 years ago, or it's a very strange phenomenon that we repeat the same talking points over and over again. And I wonder, why does that happening, Chris? What do you think it is?
Well, obviously we are stuck with some of the same problems.
Right.
So they recur. The most charitable or generous view would be that there are, antinomies that we're stuck in, and therefore we come back to the same debates because actually that's the dialectical antithesis that we're facing, or something ramified through all these different forms. That's a little bit too cute, but there's some truth to it. I thought you were going to go in a different direction because you wanted to say something about like Hamas. And, Fakhri wrote a response to really not my article on Israel-Palestine, but to our podcast on the miseducation of Rashida Tlaib. And he said, he sort of criticizes me, but he also defends me against critics. And this is in the Platypus Review this month. And basically, April issue of 2024. So what he says is, Chris Cutrone recognizes the bourgeois character of Palestinians and the bourgeois character of Hamas, right? And I think that he might mean something different than what I would mean with respect to that. Because I didn't really get into that, like in my article, for example, on Israel-Palestine and the left. I just said they're a capitalist group, they're gangsters.
Right. They're not yet at the level of bourgeois society, and neither
they're decadent. They're decadent bourgeois, right? So it's racketeering. But, at a more basic level, I would say that religious fundamentalism is bourgeois.
Oh, sure.
Right? Obviously, the Protestant Reformation was Christian fundamentalism. That's what it was. Right, it was an attempt to return to the fundamentals of original Christianity against the 1,000-year decadence of the church, right? Or 1,500-year decadence of the church, and so I think that we wouldn't have Islamic fundamentalism other than as a bourgeois ideology in capitalism.
Yeah.
I mean, there are different ways of thinking about that. You could think about it as a delayed Islamic reformation, that it's like catching up. So the Muslim world is going through what the Christian world went through 500 years ago. I don't like that idea, right? That it's they were 400 years or 500 years behind us, and that's why they're doing it now.
Yeah, especially if you read Strange Death of American Exceptionalism, which talks about how this reformation of Christianity has just continued on and on and on.
That's right.
Yeah,
absolutely. So in other words, why is it persistent? And so it's not a once and for all like aspect of the bourgeois revolution, but it recurs. And we might say that there's something about bourgeois society and capitalism that brings us back to that. Now, but again, that's a highly mediated thing. In other words, are we talking about like a Muslim work ethic with like the Protestant work? Not exactly. But it is something like individual belief, like the different kind of reconstitution of religion, the social basis of religion, that the individuals making up that society, the social individual, the character of the social individual has changed. And you could also say that it's a thoroughgoing Islamicization in a way that was not the case in traditional Islam, meaning like, the peasants in Islam are not particularly Muslim any more than the peasants in Christianity were particularly Christian. So Christianity becomes much more totalizing with Protestant Reformation. Right, it sort of encompasses society. You get rid of all the syncretic religion. You purify Christianity of all of its like pagan syncretic practices, especially at the peasant level. And that's why it's called paganism, because paganism means what the peasants do. Pagan means farmer. Right, so it is a kind of rationalization of Islam. In the modern era, that's necessitated by capitalism as a more totalizing, right? But, and that the politics also, in other words, Jean Bajalan was telling me that Hamas are liberal Democrats. And I'm like, yeah, he was just doing that to like needle me, right? And I was like, I don't know how liberal they are, but they certainly are democratic. But that's not unproblematic in capitalism, right? Because democracy keeps capitalism going, as well as capitalism being a constant crisis of democracy. So there are different elements to this, and it really does come down to, you brought in video games in a way that I didn't expect, like the crisis of the individual in society. Meaning this atomized individual, this antisocial individual, this kind of desocialized individual, this kind of thing. And I feel like I don't put much stock in that, because people have been saying that about like comic books and TV and film and rock and roll. And, it seems like every once in a while there's something that's the cause of it, or that is at least facilitating this. And I feel like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's something worse about video games. I don't know.
You don't remember what I'm referencing. I don't think probably.
Okay.
You probably were above it at the time. But no, the debates about video games aren't about, are video games good for us or bad for us? Do they make us violent? Are we too atomized by video games? No. It's like, how are female characters depicted in video games?
Oh, sure.
Video games, sexist. 4chan. 4chan and Gamergate and all that kind of thing. And it's like, but what I'm noticing, it seems to me, this is what I'm thinking is going on right now, actually, is that the Democratic Party is just throwing everything it can out there to try to, attack the right, or what they perceive to be the right, or just throwing anything and everything out into the mix. But what I think I find, I was really just sort of making a gambit. I didn't really know where I was headed with that question. But your answer has led me to say one of the difficulties I think that I'm running up against, and I think maybe everybody might be running up against, is that when you try to figure things out and situate yourself in this moment politically and remain on the left, you find that you are easily compartmentalized into something that's ready-made for you to begin, before you began. that you can easily be shifted around. Like people.
So let me make a plug for my book.
Yeah.
My book doesn't fit any of the usual categories, right?
Right.
Not surprisingly, it's platypus. Right. It doesn't fit. It's neither fish nor fowl, right?
Mm-hmm.
But really, I talk about this in the foreword to the book, which is transcending the authoritarian versus libertarian division on the left.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that four, capitalism, socialism, authoritarian, libertarian.
Mm-hmm.
Marxism doesn't really fit that. Right? It's on neither and both sides of those things. And also because the way it conceives of capitalism and socialism is more dialectical. Right?
Right.
Than other ways of thinking about socialism. Again, it's not socialism is altruistic and capitalism is greedy. Socialism is collectivist and capitalism is individualist. That Marx doesn't fit that. Marxism doesn't fit that. Any of that. And that includes libertarianism and authoritarianism. Right? So what that means is that there was a time when these debates were not all that there was in terms of a vision informing social and political action. And I mean, the Republicans and Democrats have a division of labor, meaning they divide the electorate. They cooperate in their competition. It's like, okay, we're going to be the pro-abortion party. We're going to be the anti-abortion party. Right? We're going to be the party pushing trans rights. We're going to be the party putting the brakes on trans. Right? And, they kind of spontaneously do that. It's a kind of market segmentation. They agree on how they're going to compete. And one of the things Trump disturbs is that he doesn't really fit. Not entirely. If he takes one side, it's only so that he can negotiate a compromise between the two sides. And then it's like, actually, we don't want that. We don't want to compromise because then we can't keep this thing going. We can't keep this market segmentation going. You don't want to have at the soda fountain at McDonald's, you don't want to have Pepsi or Coke or some combination of Pepsi or Coke. No, no one's ever going to do that, right? That's never going to be an option. So I think that, the left is also divided in terms of what it prioritizes, and how it sees the world, right? And again, to see that as not just gamesmanship, not just market segmentation, but also having a kind of ideological contradiction being expressed in some dim way, right? One of the things that popped up on my YouTube feed was a video that I didn't watch about like the feminist to fascist pipeline. That's interesting, I guess. I guess I could have watched that video and learned something about how many feminists became fascists. My friend Stephanie Karamitsos, who made the painting for my book's cover, she had a phrase, the feminazis.
Yeah, that's an old Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah, but she was not a Rush Limbaugh person at all, and she would have thought of herself as a feminist, but she would have thought of herself as a feminist who was persecuted by other feminists. Meaning there are the Nazi kind of feminists, and then there are the other kinds of feminists, right? There are the authoritarian feminists, and there's the more libertarian feminists, right? And whatever, right? But I was thinking, so it's also interesting how individuals will flip from left to right. And that's an interesting phenomenon. And you could say, well, it might be psychology. People are attracted to extreme ideologies, and so they can just sort of flip on that. They can go from one extreme to the other, I guess. Right? But again, we would have to try to think about that in broader terms. But being stuck in the same debates, I have to say that my big disappointment with the millennial left is that I thought that it was an authentic moment, historically, for putting old debates behind us. And instead, we've gotten mired in them. In some ways, they've been re-entrenched. And that's, one of the reasons why I would do things like total change of perspective on Milton Friedman, or total change of perspective on Donald Trump, right? Like, don't believe what people say about them. Have you considered these other dimensions? Especially because these other dimensions are not only left out of the leftist accounts, but also because they were actually the neglected sides, right? And so, what I did with the Compact article that now became a Platypus article on Friedman, I tried to do something very subtle that might have gotten past them, which is I was basically having Friedman stand in for Marx. Meaning, don't be an anti-Marxist, because Karl Marx's ideas were never really implemented. They were implemented only by half, which means not at all. And what's most interesting about Marx is what was not implemented. And we're all Marxists now. I quote Foucault in the beginning. We're all Marxists now because we're still dealing with Marx's problems. And it's the problems that were suppressed in favor of the solutions, which turned out to be a total disaster.
Yeah.
Right? And similar with Friedman. So I was having Friedman stand in for Marx there, right? Which is that the problems that Friedman sought to address are still with us. But his solutions were implemented and turned out to be a disaster. But it turns out we didn't even implement his solutions.
Right. But I think that's more true of Marx than it is of Friedman.
Of course it is. Right? No, it's true. But there's an interesting parallel there. And so one of my lines in the article is, this tells us something about the fate of intellectuals. That their ideas are only taken up partially and are just abused to serve the status quo. Yeah,
that's true. I agree. Well, listen, we've done another hour and 20 minutes. I'm going to end it there.